Hey, welcome into the Big Ten Huddle. I'm JR. That is Ryan Winters here with us to talk through the Oregon transfer portal. We want to say presented to you by FanDuel. Sometimes I forget to say that. I got to make sure I say it. So, but we're here to talk through the Oregon football transfer portal. Now, Oregon is still in line to possibly get Jordan Seton right now. A lot of insiders feel like that's going away from Oregon. So I felt like it was safe to do this podcast now. But just if you are listening after the fact and Oregon gets Jordan Seton, know that that has happened. But right now, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. We'll see. I mean, what do you think, Ryan? You think Oregon's got a chance at Jordan Seton?
Well, my green and yellow glasses, but yeah, no, I don't know. It feels like it's leaning LSU.
Yeah, it's kind of what it seems like to me as well. So we'll see what happens here. But Ryan, man, dude, tell people where they can find your content, your podcast, everything before we get started.
Absolutely, Gerald, you're the man. I'm over here on the West Coast, and it's called Sports Shot 503. I talk about the Ducks, talk about the Big Ten and national college football, and a variety of other things in the off season. Do a live stream Tuesday nights if you want to join, 5:30 Pacific Coast time.
And Ryan does a great job over there. A lot of good guests and entertaining and everything else. My go-to guy for listening about Oregon football and all that good stuff over there. So appreciate you coming on, Ryan. We are excited to have you here. All right, let's look into the Oregon transfer portal a little bit. Oregon is number 5 in the Big Ten in both 24/7 and On3. If you've listened to the past updates, you know that 24/7 tracks how much talent is coming into the program. On3 tracks talent coming in and also talent departing. So good top 5 class in the Big Ten for Oregon both ways. I do feel like the rankings are not always indicative of what is actually going on. So I like to have these guys come on here and talk through some of this stuff. So Ryan, let's start with some of the additions that Oregon made. Oregon does it again. They made huge additions in the portal while bringing back top tier talent. The entire defensive line coming back. Dante Moore obviously coming back. One difference we saw from when Michigan and Ohio State brought back all their players and when Penn State brought back their players is that Michigan and Ohio State brought in additional talent. Penn State just kind of relied on theirs. They did bring in like Trevor Pena, but he wasn't quite the difference maker of, what Michigan did at the center position with Olu. I'm forgetting what his last name was, but he was the Remington Award winner. Ohio State brought that in as well. Of course, Oregon still has Poncho and everything, but tell me, do you think Oregon has made enough additions to the roster through the portal to make a run at the national championship this year?
Well, I think Oregon's in a weird place right now because they've I think it's a good place. I wouldn't say it's a negative weird, but they have a lot of talent on this team and they've recruited very well. So, they've got the young talent and then you've got guys who you're trying to get in the portal to bolster up certain position groups or maybe certain positions of need. But I do think that as Dan Lanning has progressed during his time here, he's leaned on the portal less and less. And I think that's saying something about the guys in the building, the guys who he's recruiting. Hasn't really quite lost a starter to the transfer portal. Bunch of guys left this year. We had 27 guys out. And I think that's indicative to a good program. I think that when you have a good team and you have a bunch of guys who are maybe in the second string, third string, they're getting reps, but maybe not the reps that they feel like they might deserve or might feel like they need to put on tape for the NFL. They're going to bounce. And so we had guys like Tioni Gray, Terrence Green leave. Those were big bodies on the defensive line that you just can't really replace. Not only big bodies, but also guys who've been in your system and had guys who you've been developing. And I think early on in Dan Lanning's career, he kind of got a knock that he wasn't a developer of talent or something because, he was bringing in these transfer portal guys. But most of the transfer portal guys who have come in have actually become a much better player on their way at Oregon, right? You look at a guy, choose any of the guys that you could look at. Even a guy like Bear Alexander, for example, this year, who's going to come back next year. He had a much better year this year than he's ever had in his past. Derek Harmon, a guy coming from Michigan State, really blew up at Oregon. Look at the quarterbacks. Of course, Bo Nix is probably the best example of that, where, he just is a completely different person at Oregon. And so I really do believe that you can get guys from the transfer portal to come out to Oregon and they can actually level up a little bit and play a better system, play with a better team, and maybe just feel freer out here. I think that there's the beauty of the transfer portal for me, a guy who works with high school kids, is, you can always kind of redefine your story a little bit. And some of these guys are they're not really mature, whether it's physical or mental in their first stop. There might be have an opportunity to get a bigger bag from somebody else. That might feel like a little bit of security that they didn't have at their previous stop. And I do think that a lot of guys at Oregon have really played a lot better. So I'm excited about these guys. There's some guys who are maybe coming from a different program that maybe is not as good as Oregon, so it doesn't feel like it's the big names that you're getting necessarily. But I think that Oregon's proven in the past they can take guys from maybe a worse team, bring them out here, and have them really improve.
They might not be the biggest names, but there are definitely some players that are going to Oregon that teams did not want to lose. Minnesota did not want to lose Koi Perich. I think they allocated some of that money to the defensive line, so they were looking at that a little bit more positive than they were at the beginning. But no doubt, Koi Perich is a special player and somebody that no team wants to just let walk. Dylan Raiola, Nebraska, obviously some mixed feelings about him. We'll talk about him later on as we talk through the quarterback position a little bit. Andrew Olish for Penn State, he was a young tight end there that was going to possibly play a role this next season. And then, man, you know me, I'm a Buckeye. Aaron Scott Jr., man, he's a fantastic talent. I was just telling Jeffrey the Greek when we did the Iowa recap that Cody Haddad is going to be really good for Iowa. I think Aaron Scott is going to kill it over there at Oregon. I do wonder maybe if they should have brought in another more experienced cornerback or another experienced safety. But of course, Koi Perich has started for 2 years now. He's going to be in his third season, so he definitely has that experience that you're replacing Dylan Thieneman with and everything. But I mean, tell me about some of these guys that, maybe they're not the biggest names in the world, but they do come from programs that they didn't want to lose them, and now they're coming out to Oregon and they got an opportunity to make a name for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the offensive line and defensive line is where I like to focus on first, being a larger individual myself and a guy who played on the line. So DeAndre Robinson, I think, is a guy who's a name who it feels like he could really make some things happen. And even Jerome Simmons, coming from a little bit lower level team or whatever the case may be. But, big bodies are big bodies. And, if they can find a way in the system, I do think what you said to start off the show is the biggest story, which is they retained their entire starting defensive line. And I think that, in an era where a lot of those guys had the opportunity to maybe go into the pros, maybe their grade from the NFL wasn't as high as they wanted it to be, or whatever the case may be. I do think there's a lot of camaraderie on this team. I think the guys feel very safe and secure here. And, for example, Mateo Uyunglele and Tatum Tuioti, both those guys are guys who are real difference makers. And so, you have a plethora of defensive line. I think you'll be fine this year. Mari Washington played so good this year, and I really thought he was going to go because I thought that he had put quality film on tape for the NFL. But, you're going to have guys who come in. You lose guys who are second or third string. Well, you're going to bring in some guys who are second or third string. And then, maybe they have some room to develop coming into next year or the year after if they stick around. So, of course, those guys I was interested in. And then, you're right. I think the safety issue is another one. Safety, the way that Oregon especially runs their safety is a little bit different, I think, than maybe some other teams. There's times it feels like, they're running safeties that feel more like a linebacker. They're edging up toward the box a little bit. Carl Williams, the fourth from Baylor, looks like a guy who can play on that back end. But I also think that they have got a lot of guys coming in. Jet Washington being the guy I think people are most excited about in this recruiting class. And, this is a year, for example, the Ducks did very well this year, but it was a very young team. They were playing a lot of guys who had not much experience going into this year, true freshmen, guys who were redshirt freshmen or sophomores who are getting a lot of playing time. So I do think Dan Lanning is banking on the fact that he's got a lot of talent coming in the recruiting class, and he might not need to be able to hit such a home run in the transfer portal as much as he did when he first got here. And I do think that there's sometimes kind of a carryover effect or a layover of people who are thinking, well, that's how it was in the first couple of years. That's how it's always going to be. And I do think there's kind of a trend in Dan Lanning's time here where he's just, for the most part, leaned on the recruits more than he's leaned on the transfers. And I do think that's important because when you talk about retaining guys, you got to be able to play guys. And Dan Lanning's line has always been, if you're good enough, you're old enough. And I do think that there's a bunch of guys who are going to make a difference in this recruiting class this year. So that's, I think, the other half of the excitement for the Duck fans.
Yeah, you got to play the guys so that way, number one, you can know if they're, I mean, it's a cyclical world out there, but you got to know if they are worth the money that you're paying them, number one. And then number two, they need to see that there is actual playing time available for them so that way they don't leave and go elsewhere. So I think that's a huge thing in college football right now, trying to play younger guys. Love to hear that Dan Lanning is on board with that and everything. And I think it's going to pay off for Oregon this season and in the seasons to come as well. All right, let's look at some of the departures here. Ryan, you mentioned some of them earlier, some of the, maybe depth defensive linemen, second string type of guys who maybe thought about having an opportunity this year, but because of the defensive lineman coming back, might look like that might not be what was going to happen. Taj Lapoy, though, did go to Cal, and it looks like he took at least 3 or 4, I think it was, defenders with him to Cal, and Oregon mostly saw depth leave that might have started the next year, but players that obviously were not going to start this year because of the players that returned. Did Oregon lose any players to the portal that makes you panicked or concerned? Maybe, just for this year, let's say.
Well, the guys who I said before, Tioni Gray and, there's a variety of guys, but Terrence Green's such a big body as well. But, guys like Roger Sagapello are going to make some big noise. Cooper Perry had a pretty good year this year, wide receiver. He's going to Cal. Blake Purchase was a guy who, played really well as a freshman, and he's going to Ole Miss. Zach Grace was a guy who was very talented, played a variety of different roles for Oregon, tight end, basically H-back for them, going to LSU. Jericho Johnson, big body defensive tackle, going to Cal as well. Kamar Matuti. One of the big conversations we're having here is around that linebacker. We're constantly looking for the Dan Lanning signature linebacker crew that we kind of have been expecting over and over. And I think that, obviously this year with Bryce Betcher really played out of his mind. I mean, this is a guy who was a former walk-on. He was a baseball player. He came in as a safety, moved down to be a linebacker. He's a headhunter, but he really played well this year. And I think he actually played well enough to be able to get some NFL scouts to be able to be watching him this year, which I don't think anybody expected when he first started playing football for the Ducks. Kamar Matuti leaving is kind of a little bit of a hole there with the linebacker core. But again, I think that you're going to find that these guys are going to put positions together. There might be some position groups that you might need to bolster up a little bit. You might be a little weak in going into next year. But again, I just think next man up. There's other guys who left that I thought was kind of an interesting one. Kingston Lopez, the other one who went to Cal, big safety. I think that's a fine thing, though. I know there's maybe some Duck fans that feel kind of burned a little bit about these guys taking the guys with them, but I think that's a natural kind of prospect sort of a situation. Tosh was probably very influential in their recruiting to begin with at Oregon. He's a very influential recruiter. We know this about Tosh, and gives them an opportunity, and you want to go to a place where you can go and excel. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that in the transfer portal.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I did this, in addition to doing each team and wanting to understand things better, is I also wanted fans to understand that other programs are going through what they're going through as well. So if there are Oregon Duck fans out there who are listening to this and saying, yeah, we did lose a lot of depth, we did lose a lot of players, go listen to my Ohio State recap with Eric Boggs. Go listen to my Michigan State recap with Matt Sheehan. Like, all of these teams are losing players. Now, obviously, Michigan State is going through a coaching change, so that's a different situation. But Ohio State's not going through a coaching change, and they lost over 30 players to the transfer portal. A lot of them depth pieces, a lot of them guys that could have possibly started next season. And it's just kind of the way, it's kind of the way college football works right now. And so it doesn't always mean there's something wrong with your culture. It doesn't always mean that something is wrong with this or that or whatever. Sometimes guys just leave because they want opportunities, they want a payday, they want whatever it might be, and or they got bad advice. We don't always know, but I always encourage people, don't demonize the kid just because he left. Everybody has a different story. Everybody has different reasons. We can't just call every single guy greedy, because at the end of the day, we don't know the true reasons why these guys might leave.
Absolutely. It's a business. I mean, it's a business. And now that you've got this NIL situation where the guys are going to get paid, guys are going to get offered more money from a different school, I think there's a lot to be said about that. I think there's also something to be said about how you're allocating your funds, right? I don't know if there's necessarily the salary cap issue like we have in the NFL, but if you're going to, let's say, pay your quarterback who's coming back, who's making a big deal, you're probably going to up the ante on him a bit. And there might be some money there that you can't spend somewhere else. So, there's a negative to that, I guess, as well. But, when it comes to guys coming back, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And the NIL has definitely kept a lot of guys, or at least retained guys who might think, hey, I need to go get the bag from the NFL. Now they can say, hey, wait a minute, I might be able to develop here, be able to get paid here, and then be able to get a bigger payday once I actually get to the NFL. And that's really, I think, the whole conversation around most of these guys returning.
Yeah, there's no salary cap right now in college football. I know the House is trying to do their thing and everything, but we're gonna need a whole lot more rules and stuff like that to happen before this salary cap is enforceable. You brought up bringing back Dante Moore and that whole situation. I think a lot of people were very perplexed when they heard that Dante Moore was coming back, because not too long before that, it was announced that Dylan Raiola was going to Oregon. Now, he was always a little bit rumored to be going to Oregon, but he didn't take a whole lot of visits. Everybody's kind of like, what's going on with Dylan Raiola? He eventually goes on a visit. He commits to Oregon. I told people from the beginning, I think this means Dante Moore is coming back. People didn't want to believe me, but I said, guys, Dylan Raiola is probably not going to practice in the spring. He might be held out a little bit of fall camp as well. I don't think Oregon's going to go out there and, put next season on a quarterback that might be injured going into spring and going into fall camp. I think Oregon's going to make a really big effort at bringing Dante Moore back, and they did. And so now they're paying Dante Moore. They're, in turn paying Dylan Raiola as well. I'm sure he's not coming for cheap or anything like that. What are your thoughts? Do you feel like I'm right there? Do you feel like this was a surprise for Dylan Raiola? What are your thoughts on the quarterback situation and bringing Raiola in?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. Early on this year, we had the reports that it was pretty much not a guarantee that Dante was going to come back, but it was going to take something miraculous for him to be able to take that next leap. And, I think he was just very comfortable at Oregon. I think he wanted to spend one more year here. Obviously, he's getting his bills paid by the NIL, but it's nowhere near NFL money. NFL money is career money. It's generational money. But it's still going to be there. And I think that's the cool thing about the NIL is just provided a little bit of a cushion, a little bit of a buffer before guys really kind of try to go for that next level. And I think there's been a lot of examples of benefiting from coming back for one more year. Pre-NIL, Justin Herbert didn't go out his junior year, came back his senior year and put on about 20 pounds of muscle, looked a completely different guy, had a much better senior year than he did his junior year. And then he was ready when the NFL came and called him. Obviously, it was a weird situation with that spike in the lung of Tyrod Taylor. But the ideology is that when he had his number called in the NFL, he was ready to play. And then he went on, won Rookie of the Year. And I think Bo Nix is another great example of that, going to a team, slipping in the draft a little bit, going to a better team in the Broncos, maybe than other guys in front of him. But he was ready to play on day one. There's no question about that. And I do think that the growth, mental, physical, emotional, really adds up. And Dante's a unique guy. I mean, he's a guy who was the number one quarterback coming out of high school. Obviously, we know the story of him going, decommitting from Oregon, going to UCLA, and really not seeing the progress that he wanted to see at UCLA, taking a wild gamble where he actually went to Oregon to back up, Dylan Gabriel. That was kind of a unique play. And I don't think a lot of people in the country saw that coming. And so that kind of gave me a reason why he would stay, right? He's kind of zigged when everybody else is zagged a little bit. He's been unconventional a little bit in that manner, but also he has not started that many games, and he doesn't have the amount of kind of a consistency maybe that you're looking for. Also, the way the season ended, it was terrible, right? That last game against Indiana, he looked completely out of sorts. Multiple, fumbles, interception to start the game. I mean, just some real bad play from him that was uncharacteristic, because going into that game, he had been playing very well for the Ducks. And I think that the NFL scouts, also kind of hype guys up based on their class, right? There's not the biggest, strongest class this year for the NFL quarterbacks. And so Dante Moore was being looked at as possibly a number 1, number 2 pick in that quarterback draft. And I don't know if that'll be the case next year, because I think next year's quarterback class is very good. But if he goes out and has the same year that he had this year, with the big arm, with the big body, and he can do a lot of things on the field, I think the NFL is still going to become calling. Now the Raiola thing, I think you're totally on, because I think he had a kind of a similar path to Dante Moore. Given the keys early, expected to bail this team out. Nebraska was nowhere near the team people thought they were going to be. They had put a lot of pressure on a freshman quarterback. And I've always said that if you start a freshman quarterback, your team's not good. I don't care how good the freshman quarterback is. If you should have somebody in your quarterback room who's older and better than the freshman coming in, unless the freshman is an absolute phenom. But we rarely see that. And so I do think that there's a precedent set that, hey, Dante went out as a freshman, didn't do very well. Raiola went out as a freshman, looked better than Dante did as a freshman year. I think that Raiola can really spin it, but I don't think that system was right. I think there was a lot of pressure put on him. And then, of course, with the injury, it all fell apart there. And now he has time to breathe. He has time to get healthy. Like you said, he's probably not going to play in the spring, come out in the fall, maybe late in the fall. And that's not something you want to do for the pressure that Oregon is, especially with this team coming back next year. And I think that a lot of guys in that room all kind of got together and say, hey, let's run it back one more time. They announced it at different times, but I tend to think that 3 weeks till the end of the season, most of these guys had the idea. And Poncho actually came out and said, I'm coming back next year. Then Bear came out and said, I'm coming back next year before even the CFP run. I think that said a lot about what this team was going to do next year. And the table is set up. It's a good season next year. It's a really good schedule next year. And I do think that Oregon is poised to go on a pretty good run next year. And it all starts with your quarterback.
Well, and I think that your quarterback coming back and Bear and everybody else coming back as well really speaks to the coordinators that are coming in here too, because Oregon lost both Will Stein and Taj Lapoy, and Dan Lanning is elevating from within. And there are some people that have the thought out there, well, when you elevate from within and, it's Dabo Sweeney and his cousins and all this stuff, it's not going to go well or whatever. I fully trust Dan Lanning in his hiring process. He has not given me a reason to not trust him with the guys that he hires. I do have a little bit of concern with elevating two guys for the coordinator positions at the same time, but both of them were co-coordinators and everything. Last question here, Ryan, if you don't mind, just give me your thoughts on the coordinators. Obviously, these guys are not a part of the transfer portal, but they are a piece of getting the transfer portal talent in there and retaining guys like the defensive line, Dante Moore, and all that stuff. How much trust do you have in the coordinators that are being elevated to those positions?
Yeah, that's a great point, JR. Part of the process of retention, I think, is maintaining some consistency in your coaching staff. And I actually think that these guys were thinking that last year Will Stein was going to go and Tosh Lupoy were going to go because, the success that Oregon had last year, you would expect other teams to come calling. It just happened that this is the year that you had absolute Armageddon happen across the board when it comes to coaches being fired. You had so many positions open, and you could really kind of pinpoint exactly who would be the best position for that. I think obviously Tosh is a perfect spot for Cal, being a guy from there. And then, Will Stein, obviously, with his connections to Kentucky, I think that's an absolute home run as well. But yeah, they had put these guys in position last year to be kind of the co-offensive coordinator, co-defensive coordinator. Drew Maringer has a little bit longer history than Chris Hampton does with Dan, but I really like Drew. And I think if you get to know him a little bit better, he's a very, very interesting guy. He's been a tight end coach, but he played quarterback. He knows the game very well. And I do think that he is an aggressive play caller. I think that you're going to see, a lot of people were questioning a little bit some of the stuff Will Stein was doing. Of course, that first play in that game, I love to start at any time with running the ball in the first play. I'm a former offensive lineman. We want to run the ball, but that out route, that screen pass, that sort of stuff that really isn't pushing the ball downfield at all. I think a lot of Duck fans were fairly disappointed in some of the play calling with Will Stein. And I liked Will a lot. I thought he played a major role for Oregon's success. But there were some definite question marks. And I do think that people were kind of hesitant about him and some of his play calling. So hopefully you're going to see a little bit more explosive stuff with Drew. But I do also think that defensively, it's really about all the position coaches, and they've got some really good position coaches in there. And I think that the future is very bright for Oregon. But I do think that last year they had put those guys kind of in position because they thought that it was going to happen last year. And the fact that it didn't, they were just even more ready for this year. Once that thing happened, they could just put those guys right into place.
Good news is no matter what, you got Alik Terry there coming back. And Alik Terry to me is one of the best position coaches, not just offensive line coaches, but one of the best position coaches in all of college football. Obviously, Ross Douglas, all these other guys that are there as well are fantastic. The defensive line coach, his name is escaping me right now.
Tuioti. That's Tatum.
Tuioti, that's right.
Tuioti's dad. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so great position coaches there, and that's always a good help to these coordinators who are coming into the situation. All right, Ryan, thank you so much for giving us the insight on the Oregon transfer portal. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention before we get out of here?
On the way out, I would like to agree with you on Elite Terry. Absolute elite individual, super good recruiter, great family. I got a chance to be able to hang out with his dad in Miami. He's from Miami. And so I was definitely in that family circle this year, this fall. It was very fun. But no, I'm a big fan of Elite Terry. I think that he's one of the best in the country. He's a great teacher of the game, obviously. But I think what he does best is really relates to the players. And he's a great recruiter. And that's kind of why I do think we might still be in the running with Jordan Seton a little bit, just in the fact that how it went down, where of course he was in LSU and then they thought he was going to Eugene for a visit. Instead, Dan and Elite go to him that night. And I do think that there's something to be said about that. If that doesn't happen, though, I think the Ducks are fine. Like I said, I think that the offensive line group is very strong, even without him as an addition.
Can we start calling him Elite Terry? Is that okay?
Elite Terry. That's awesome.
I just thought of that as you were talking about it. I was like, there we go. All right. That's a new nickname for Elite Terry here on the Big Ten Huddle. Elite Terry. There we go. All right. Everybody go check out Ryan's stuff over at Sports Chat 503. Excellent channel over there. Oregon Duck football, Oregon Duck basketball, Big Ten, all that good stuff. Ryan, great friend of the program and the show. And we would appreciate it if anybody goes over there, like, subscribe that content, and like and subscribe to this content as well. If you're somebody from Sports Chat 503, you can get a little bit of me, a little bit of Ryan, and we'll, of course, show up on each other's channels every now and then. All right. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Ryan, for coming in and giving us your knowledge on the Oregon Ducks. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.